Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Harriet Tubman. So, who is the blackest? This is the impossible question that Kenyatta Forbes, multidisciplinary artist and former Chicago public school teacher, poses to all the players of Trading Races. Trading Races is a card game with 52 cards in the deck, each one with a notable black figure, and some otherwise notable figures. Each player gets 5 cards, and the objective is to convince everyone that the player in your hand is the blackest. Described by Dexter Thomas of Vice News as the blackest card game he's ever played, the game both delights and discomfits players. So, we return to the very first question. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman. Who is blacker? The game's purpose is not to untangle this question, but to knot it up even further. The criteria for blackness is not only muddied by the unreal reality of race itself, but by what each person, every time a group of people sits down to play Trading Races, believes makes a person black. Or specifically, what makes a person more black than someone else. In one such instance, only a few weeks ago, I was playing this game. In a strange process of elimination, it came down to Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Harriet Tubman. As we were arguing for each person, voices overlapping and didactic statements being thrown around with a certain glee, Nelson Mandela was knocked out of the running. But why? He is black. The group was unequivocal about that. But he was not the blackest, because he was South African, not Black American. The general consensus was that black culture mainly came from America, and black culture was an integral part of blackness. So, if you were not Black American, you obviously couldn't be the blackest person in a stack of cards that included other Black Americans. Surprisingly, to me at least, this notion passed with very little objection. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, not because I was offended as a non-American black person, but more because I was perplexed by the lack of conversation around these statements. Every other notion, for the most part, that was thrown around had been heavily debated before it was kind of passed like a law. But this had just fallen out of someone's lips and taken as truth, or at least taken as obvious. What's so obvious about that idea? Why wasn't there more of a conversation on if Americanness was central to blackness? Is it the ethnic demographic of featured people in the game Trading Races? Does it pre-inscribe or orient the players to tangle the idea of specifically American blackness? Was it just that I was playing in an American school system in America with Americans? If so, is Africa so unimportant to the American conception of blackness? Does a game that is meant to reverse the obviousness of race, to expose how troubling and unclear blackness is, still limit its conception of blackness in one respect: nation? So, to face the statements brought up during that game, how much does Africa play into American blackness today? Black Americans have always had an undeniable connection to Africa, at least as a place of former home. But specifically, the idea and concept of an African diaspora was introduced into modern scholarship in 1965, the first international conference on African history. Ashraf H.A. Rushdie defined diaspora as peoples who are already organized as a nation, dispersed to other lands where they take their national identity with them, modifying it and the place they arrive, the host land. He goes on further to write that the case of the African diaspora adds one more layer of complexity to the question of the relationship between nation and diaspora, since it is a dispersal of people who are generally not thought of as belonging to a nation, but whose diaspora seem to have produced one. He writes that the concept of an African diaspora in the first place was introduced in an effort to connect those forcibly displaced by slavery to their homelands, to resist the separatist colonial project of racism. But even as the term was being adopted, it strained under the weight of joining people who are so different culturally and so physically far apart. Rushdie cites the realities of nations shedding colonial rule as an added pressure point on the idea of one connected global African diaspora. It is one thing, for instance, Rushdie writes, to claim an allegiance to Ethiopia when that name conjures up general images of African glory. It is quite another when that same name conjures up a history in which an emperor subjugated ethnic communities like the Oromo and the Tigray to establish the boundaries of his nation-state. But, Rushdie notes, this did not stop anyone from trying to establish the idea of an African diaspora, and from people still using that idea to connect to Africa from America. Sarah Abelin, of African descent, Blackness and the Concept of Origins in Cultural Perspective, writes about how the perceived importance for U.S. citizens of being able to name an ethnicity or culture of origin is today underpinned by the convention of the hyphenated American identity. This change was catalyzed by the Civil Rights Movement, which introduced a new and contagious idiom of group identity and group rights on the American scene. Abel links the publication of Alex Haley's Roots in 1976 and the novel's subsequent TV adaptation to the repopularization of the Back to Africa movement, coming at it in a genealogical sense. Haley's narrative planted the notion of the African root as a unique and historically authentic lineage waiting to be uncovered, an ideal that has come to eclipse other collective projects of return. Sarah Abel's writing echoes my initial thoughts after I had sat with the assertion that Americanness is central to Blackness. Let's replay the game. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman. If a large portion of Black people are said to have originated in Africa, then wouldn't actually being from Africa, born and raised, arguably makes Nelson Mandela the blackest person in this hand? Now, I'm not trying to say that I'm right. This is the conversation I'm trying to have. But what made this rebuttal not come out of someone else's mouth or my mouth? Perhaps genealogy has fallen out of favor in how people define their blackness today. Perhaps genealogy has stood down to a more encompassing force, culture. The implication is that Africa doesn't have much of an impact on Black culture, at least not enough to stand up to Black America's impact on Black culture. To not get too much into the weeds on Africa's influence on Black culture in general, which is immense and has filled several books, I will try to focus on recent influences. The Guardian's Grace Schutte explores the impact of Africa on Black culture.
34% of Africans are online. That's 165 million more users than in the United States. If we're just going by numbers, it's natural that Africans would be influential in digital culture.
Social media has sort of increased visibility of African art or media. So we think about YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and the ways that they have sort of globalized media in Africa.
A.K. Anthony and J. Nguyen discuss the way Black Americans construct their identity in Black authenticity, defining the ideals and expectations in the construction of real Blackness. They write, research and cultural representations and products thus suggest Black authenticity is constructed through commodified, controlling images. They go on to broadly define Black authenticity as a cultural resource legitimized through ideologies, actions, and interactions. Black authenticity includes ideals and expectations that affect what it means to be Black in relation to personal, public, and cultural identities. So, as I've tried to show here, Africa is a big part of Black culture, not just in general over time, but specifically now. So finally, we turn to the game itself. What about this game might have contributed to the idea that Africa isn't a big part of Black culture? Let's look at the deck. What are the demographics here? 21 Black American political figures, 4 repeats. 31 Black American pop culture figures, 10 repeats. 12 white American culture figures, 1 repeat. 1 Asian person, 1 repeat. 3 Africans, 2 repeats, and 1 Jamaican. There is a clear disparity here. While not everything is always a numbers game, in a card game, it matters quite a lot. It's 52 Black Americans to 3 Africans. That's not just a little bit skewed, it's quite a large gap. In a card deck full of a wide and frequently hilarious range of characters, from Jimmy Fallon to Malcolm X to Stacey Dash, it seems interesting that the only Africans in the pack are Fela Kuti, Nelson Mandela, and Trevor Noah. It is not just that there are less African cards, so there is a much lower chance of getting an African in your hand to play and then argue for being the blackest. It is also that such a short amount of African cards means there is a very short range of the type of Africans and the type of African figure that you can play. The Black American cards have a much wider range of Black people and thus neatly represent Kenyatta Forbes' idea behind fading races to complicate ideas of Blackness. In the small pile of African figures, we have 2 political figures, Nelson Mandela and Trevor Noah, and 1 more pop culture type of figure, Fela Kuti. What I find interesting about these 3 Africans is that they all, in some way or another, fall slightly more to the political figure camp than the pop culture figure. Trevor Noah is a little more arguable, as he is a literal talk show host, but he's more known for his politics as a South African who grew up in apartheid than really for his jokes on his late night show. Similarly for Fela Kuti, though an obvious musical powerhouse influencing everyone from Beyonce to Talking Heads, is also really remembered equally, if not more so, for his political verve. And Nelson Mandela is, well, Nelson Mandela. So there isn't just this skewed representation of Africans in general in the pack, 3 versus 52, but really a skewed representation of the type of Africans. So what conclusions can we draw here? To the question of how much import we should put into Americanness when thinking about blackness, I'm not really sure. I can't be the final word on it. This is not an indictment of Trading Races. The fact that the game itself and its mechanics reflects the difficulty of encompassing blackness is not only ironic, but in my view, part of the point. Kenyatta Forbes even references this idea of her herself realizing her limited views of blackness while playing her own game.
Just being a black American, ooh, that felt weird saying American, but a black person in the world. It's a game that, I mean, even me playing it, sometimes I'm like, damn, why did I think that? Like, that's fucked up.
At the end of the day, my inquiry into this was sparked by Kenyatta Forbes' very ethos, for players to ruminate on the impossibility of defining blackness any one way. But while she certainly does not completely discount nationality in her efforts to get people to talk about blackness, I believe that Trading Races, at least in the form I encountered it in, limits the conversations one can have in that respect. It's impossible to encompass every black diaspora in one game, so I'm not arguing for that. And I'm not arguing for Trading Races to fully solve the tangles of the African diaspora. I haven't even addressed the lack of black British figures in Trading Races, or the fact that there is one Jamaican in the pack. I do think something material can be done about its relationship to African figures. A famous African suspension pack will not solve the problem of blackness, and that's not what we want to do here. We want to keep having conversations. It may not even mitigate Nelson Mandela being knocked out of a round, but it would certainly widen the scope of Trading Races. Maybe make the arguments around the table longer and more impassioned, or at least make us consider this question just a little more. Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, or Nelson Mandela? Who is blacker?